A large E. coli outbreak at 11 daycare centers in Calgary has the government scrambling a bit to not only contain the outbreak, but to also tackle a bit of a communications crisis. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, there are around 250 people who are confirmed to have E. coli and around 25 kids in hospital, many needing blood transfusions and dialysis. Do we know for certain what caused this massive outbreak?
We don't, not yet. The best guess, and I mean it's a relatively well-informed guess at this point, is that it came from a shared kitchen that a number of these facilities used. So the government held sort of its first big press conference on this outbreak on Tuesday, and the outbreak was, I believe, declared on September 4th, a week and a bit ago, at any rate. And and they said that they had a health inspection of this kitchen, found critical incidents, including pests, evidence of pests in the kitchen, which I believe were cockroaches, some sanitation things, stuff like that. So the public health team is doing this, like, it's quite a remarkable investigation actually when they lay it all out. They're taking samples of food that was at the facility. They're taking samples of leftovers that had been served. They're interviewing people who fell ill for their food histories. They're interviewing people who did not fall ill for their food histories, and trying to sort of triangulate a bit on what actually might be the sort of ground zero, I guess, patient zero, or whatever the food was that caused this outbreak. It is worth noting, I mean, a number of, as you mentioned, of the kids in hospital are really, really ill, quite seriously ill. There's been blood transfusions, a number are on IV fluids, just because, so many fluids are coming back out, I suppose, to put it a little delicately. And so they're under sort of close monitoring in hospital. There's 3 blood work clinics that have been set up at health centers around Calgary for people that need regular blood testing on this. So it's a big public health issue, for starters. But the other side of this is, as you mentioned, the communications part. And that has to do basically with the fact that the government didn't have a press conference for about a week. And as I said, it was a very robust press conference, lots and lots of information given. But the question did come up, why did you wait a week? Why was it so long before there was a press conference? And the line that the government gave was, look, we've been communicating with the parents and the families before the broader public. And there was a bit of a gaffe when Dr. Mark Joffe, the chief medical officer of health, said he didn't feel any urgency to sort of update the public. And of course, he immediately sort of had to walk that back in a statement after saying, what I meant to say was we were prioritizing the people affected first. So, a little bit of a communications problem there. The NDP is calling for, sort of a broader inquiry into what went wrong on this. But, from everything that the government said, the public health officials said, they are most likely going to get to the bottom of this. And hopefully everyone who's in hospital recovers and it doesn't get any worse.
Yeah, the Alberta NDP has called for a full investigation into this outbreak, but it looks like the wheels are already in motion in that regard, so that's good to see. Tyler, the province also moved to overhaul the bail system to prevent repeat offenders from doing some of those serious crimes. Officials say the first thing they're implementing is a dedicated urban crime prosecution unit. What will that really look like?
Well, they're basically going to be focusing on sort of urban crime in Edmonton and Calgary, I believe. And so that's going to be things like, say, drug houses. There are problem houses in certain neighborhoods. These teams that will have sort of liaisons with the police and social services and things like that, and really sort of focus on some of these particularly problematic issues. Now, all of this, of course, is coming in response to the sort of increased amount of crime that we're seeing across Alberta and cities, rural areas, and across the country as a whole as well. So there's sort of 3 initiatives. You mentioned the first one, which is this prosecution unit. The second one is they're going to eliminate what's been in place since 2017, and this is a triage protocol among Crown prosecutors. Now, back in 2016, the Supreme Court of Canada had a ruling called the Jordan decision. And what that did is it set a ceiling basically on how long it could take a person to go to trial. So if you're charged with a crime in September 2023, you basically have 18 months before that case needs to go to trial, or 30 months. It sort of, depends on the case. But you have a ceiling. The case needs to go to trial in this amount of time. And so in 2017, this triage protocol came in. And what it meant was that Crown prosecutors focused on the most serious, the most significant, the cases that they were most likely to secure convictions on. And then in the other cases, they might, for example, seek plea deals. The sort of controversy over this is that, of course, that leads to fewer crimes being prosecuted because they're seeking plea deals, et cetera, et cetera. So if the government drops this, they're going to be prosecuting more crimes. That's the idea, that more crimes are going to go through the court system, lead to convictions, perhaps, lead to more jail time, perhaps. The question is whether or not I think Crown Attorney offices are well staffed enough, have the resources necessary to do this. Because, of course, the more crimes you prosecute, the less attention, the less people there are to take on some of these more serious ones, the ones that are coming up against those Jordan deadlines. So that's going to be quite interesting to see, I think, how the prosecution service across the province tackles that, how many more Crown prosecutors are going to be hired, what the funding is going to look like, so on and so forth. The third thing is also really interesting, and this is basically that Crown prosecutors have been told to seek detention, i.e. not let people out on bail for serious offenses unless there are some sort of bail conditions that can mitigate the risk to the public. Sounds logical. And it is, because the Crown Prosecutors Association, the group that represents Crown prosecutors, came out on Tuesday and said, well, this is what we thought we've been doing all along. This has always been the policy. So it's a little bit unclear, what's happening with that one. But at any rate, this is a broader sort of attempt to tackle some of the issues that we're seeing on the streets, whether that's, people who are out on bail committing crimes again, things like that.
Tyler, Premier Daniel Smith says Alberta will have carbon capture incentives developed by the end of November. Now, this should really encourage more technology development and the installation of that particular technology, will it not?
That's the idea. Carbon capture and storage is a really integral part of Alberta's sort of plan to get to net zero, to reduce emissions over the next 25 years or so. And it's also, going to be key if we're going to hit the Liberals' sort of net zero deadline for the electricity grid, which I think is 2035, unless I'm completely blanking on that. So there's this desire to have some sort of tax credit incentive program to sort of develop these technologies, to get them installed on power plants and whatnot. The other thing that's kind of interesting that's happening on this front is Alberta's in discussions with the federal government to see what sort of other mechanisms, other levers can be pulled to get this done. So there's this whole sort of working group that Alberta's got with the federal government right now on some of these sort of energy things, which is, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, they're playing nice a little bit over here while still yelling at each other in public. So that's just another, I would say, component of these broader discussions, looking at some source of cooperation between the governments.
So now the province is also negotiating with the federal government to get federal tax credits and incentives in line with what the province really wants to achieve?
Yeah, that seems to be the case. Say Alberta offers a tax credit for carbon capture and storage. Well, maybe the federal government can, maybe there's some grant funding or a tax credit that the feds can offer as well to sort of, further incentivize this sort of development.
Now let's talk about what happened in Quebec City recently at the recent Tory convention. Delegates adopted a resolution to really support Canadian energy. That's good for us here in Alberta. That's not much of a surprise, but it's really nice for the oil and gas sector here.
Sure. And, the other thing is that I think it really contrasts the Conservative Party with the Liberal Party. An election, I think, needs to be held by 2025, could happen in theory any moment if Jagmeet Singh's New Democrats decide to jump ship. But yeah, they basically said they're going to support oil and gas. They're going to look at a very gradual transition towards renewables and the reduction of the use of fossil fuels, that sort of thing. And I think this resolution was very, very overwhelmingly passed. So that's not a huge surprise. The Conservative Party has always been, I would say, a little more supportive of the oil and gas sector than the Trudeau Liberals, for sure. But just interesting that, that came up again. It's not like it needed to come up again. Everyone in the Conservative Party is sort of on the same page on that one, I would say. But nevertheless, still interesting that was an issue that came up and a motion for a policy that was adopted by delegates at that convention.
Let's talk about West Texas Intermediate for just a moment here, hovering over $80 US a barrel. That could really help boost our bottom line here in the province. Could we potentially see any dividend checks like Ralph Buck's so many years ago?
I don't know. That does seem like the sort of thing that a populist premier like Danielle Smith might go in for. But, I do think this government has a good number of spending priorities. If you look at their mental health and addictions file, for example, building treatment centers, hiring professionals, there's big expenditures, I think. There's no sort of easy way to get around it. This is a pretty big spending Conservative government. So I think there's a lot of priorities that they're going to want to put money into. It wouldn't surprise me, though, if we saw some more affordability measures. I don't know what those would look like, but that certainly wouldn't surprise me. At the fiscal update a couple weeks ago now, I think they'd said that they were looking at a $2.4 billion surplus. And with oil prices sort of seemingly on their way back up, everyone in the industry is sort of predicting a strong finish to 2023. That could boost some of the numbers that the Alberta government's looking at coming into budget season next year. And so, you have to wonder where that money is going to go. Is it going to be affordability? Is it going to be some of these policy priorities? Is it going to be rebuilding the Heritage Savings Trust Fund? Is it going to be paying down debt?
Right.
In all likelihood, it's a combination of all those things, I would suspect. But certainly better than going back to the days of we were trading at negative prices not all that long ago.
When I was chatting with a couple of ministers recently on BC, and they said, yeah, their priority is paying down that debt. That's a big thing right now for this government. Now, Tyler, there's also some talk that Premier Daniel Smith may invoke the Sovereignty Act this fall over fears of a production or emissions cap by Ottawa, speaking of oil.
Yeah, so there's some talk that there's going to be so I'll back up slightly. The federal government is going to at some point put in a cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector, and the question is whether or not that emissions cap is going to amount to a production cut. The oil and gas sector says it almost certainly will lead to a production cut, and this is obviously rather unpopular with Alberta's Conservatives, and so there is some talk, among punditry and stuff like that, about whether or not this is the sort of thing that the Sovereignty Act might be used for. It was, I think, always unlikely that the Sovereignty Act was going to be used for some sort of small potato policy files, but these do seem like the sort where they might try and do that. So, as we've talked about before, the question is, what does this actually look like? If the Sovereignty Act is invoked, if the motion is brought to the legislature and passed, what does that actually do? And primarily, it seems to be that will forbid Alberta government officials, bureaucrats, et cetera, from cooperating with the federal government on these files. So does that do anything? Well, maybe, but also maybe not. There's an awful lot the feds can just do on their own. They have their own bureaucrats and their own police force and their own whatever. So, but it's primarily, I would say, political if it goes down that road. On some of the electricity grid stuff, on this oil and gas emissions cap, there's probably a pretty strong political impetus for the UCP to go down this road. But as we've always talked about, the effect of this, I think, is very much up in the air.
Let's circle back to the CPC Policy Convention, which took place in Quebec City recently. Tyler, another resolution creating some chatter around the water cooler is how an Alberta delegation proposed a policy to ban trans women from female sports teams, locker rooms, and washrooms.
Yeah, and you know what? It's interesting because the delegation that brought this forward was, I believe, from Edmonton Strathcona. So it's the UCP crew by like a pretty considerable margin, the most progressive riding in the country. And that was also passed. It was not without controversy, certainly. There were a number of delegates who spoke against that policy at the convention. But the thing that I find very interesting about this is that it strikes me as likely that when the UCP holds their convention in November, there's going to be a number of policies along those same lines, whether that's questions of parental rights, whether that's transgender treatment, gender reassignment surgery, all those things. And I suspect that's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for Danielle Smith, who has always sort of tried to stay outside of these discussions when she was Wild Rose leader back in 2009 to 2012, that kind of era. She sided with progressives during the Gay Straight Alliance debates that would have been, I think, 2014. So her personal views are potentially a little bit out of step with what some of the party's grassroots are almost certainly going to ask for. So, the question is whether or not those motions are going to pass. And I think it's probably fair to say that if they come forward, they will. But then the question is whether or not they make it into a policy platform in some way. And of course, this was a problem that Jason Kenney ran into. He sort of said that, no, look, the buck stops with me. I'm not going to put in policy planks that I think are going to jeopardize our electoral fortunes. So it has the potential to put Danielle Smith in a position where she's at odds with her party membership, I think. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how she negotiates that, because even in recent weeks when this has come up in Saskatchewan and Ontario and New Brunswick, she's kind of said, look, this is an issue I don't want to politicize, and she sort of evaded the issue a little bit. So it's a very interesting and I think a little bit of a sticky file for her.
Tyler, we only have about a minute left here, but I wanted to ask you about the Alberta NDP They have a petition out at the moment to get universal health care coverage for prescription contraception. At the moment, birth control is only covered by insurance plans. But what happens if somebody doesn't have insurance?
Yeah, well, then you just have to pay out of pocket for your birth control pills or IUD or whatever. So, this is a relatively long-standing sort of left-wing position that there should be universal contraception, universal coverage for contraception. So it's quite interesting, and I don't remember them talking about this during the election. Maybe they did, but I kind of feel like maybe they should have made a bigger deal about it a few months ago. They might have swung a couple votes their way.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.